Pakistan think tank, employing impact-driven research and advocacy in establishing institutional linkages to accelerate actionable and inclusive energy and climate transition. In addition to the organization's work on market design and auctions for Pakistan, we are also developing a guidebook on how to set up renewable energy plants in Pakistan. A Renewable Energy Developers Forum is also being established, and the organization is also developing and analyzing data-driven models to optimize costs for national energy grid in the country. So regarding today's events, as per the ARE policy 2019, procurement of renewable energy in Pakistan has to go through auctions now. Auctions, as you will find out over the next hour and a half, I suppose, is a widely used method of energy procurement. It can be designed to cater for diverse policy goals. Auctions are very transparent, they are very competitive, and if properly carried out, they can be very efficient in resulting in true price discovery, in reduced tariffs, market growth, and local value creation. But at the same time, there are potential outcomes that are negative for auctions. Poorly designed auctions can do a lot of harm, such as heavy administrative costs, barriers to entry could lead to, especially for small developers, could lead to concentration of awards. We could see low completion rates. All of these are challenges that needs to be catered in an optimal auction design. So during this session, we'll be discussing different auction design elements with a key focus on identifying the best needs, requirements, optimal outcomes for Pakistan as we adopt an auctions-based procurement model for our country. Today, we are joined here by subject experts from the AEDB, the World Bank, Engro Energy, Woodmac, University of Cape Town, and they will all be sharing their insights during the next hour. So we will be starting with the launch of a white paper, which is prepared by Renewables First, Mr. Ammar Qaseem. This white paper explores different auction designs across the globe and tries to draw parallels and best fits for the country. Before we begin, let me lay down some housekeeping rules for our participants. I would request our speakers to keep their microphones off when they're not speaking to ensure good audio quality for everyone. I would also encourage the speakers to switch on their camera, especially when they are speaking, if their network allows to do so without any disruptions. The seminar will be recorded. The video will be posted online. You're also welcome to revisit the discussion later and feel free to share it within your networks. A video of the event and a digital copy of the white paper that Ammar will be presenting shortly will be shared with all registered participants. We also invite questions from our audience and colleagues at the end in a dedicated Q&A session. At the same time, we also welcome questions as the session proceeds. Please feel free to use the Q&A box on the right side to post any questions. We would also encourage you to identify the particular respondent for any query posted through the chat box or the Q&A panel. So without any further ado, let me introduce Mr. Qaseem. Ammar is an energy specialist at Renewables First. He studied energy and public policy from Georgia Institute of Technology on the Fulbright program, where he worked on demand response programs. Currently, Ammar is working on the topic of upcoming renewable energy auctions in Pakistan with an eye on international best practices. He's also responsible for working with different agencies, developers, and stakeholders to incorporate their interests in policy recommendations for an inclusive growth of renewable energy sector. Ammar will be presenting a white paper titled Renewable Energy Auctions in Pakistan, Thinking Beyond Cost, which will help the attendees to get up to speed with latest trends, features, and best practices related to auctions. So over to you, Ammar, please.
Thank you, Mustafa, for the introduction. Can you see my screen? Is my screen visible? All right. So the topic of our white paper is renewable energy auctions in Pakistan, thinking beyond costs. I will start by telling you why auctions are relevant for us today here in Pakistan. And I will continue on to describing what an auction entails and what kind of trends do we see in auctions across the globe. Then I will focus on the case of Pakistan and the market development that we see in the last 10 years. And then I will discuss our national goals, which are present in our policy documents, which are supposed to give a coherent direction to our energy sector. And after that, I will show you some examples globally of auctions where different countries have used different practices to achieve certain goals. And then we will focus on the case of South Africa in particular. And finally, I will leave you with some key takeaways for a path forward. So first of all, why are auctions relevant for us? The ARE policy document, the ARE 2019, is a landmark document in the history of Pakistan. And it has envisaged that from now on, the primary mode of procurement of all renewables is going to be through auctions. And the document also set out that by 2030, we will have at least 30% of our electricity mix coming from renewables, mainly solar and wind. And when the IGSEP document, which is the main planning document for capacity expansion in Pakistan, when the IGSEP came out, it through some constraints and limitations of its optimization, it limited that target practically to 20% by 2030. Now, even if we achieve 20% and not 30%, this is still a big achievement. But credit goes to IGSEP, which laid out a very clear plan for us for the next 8 years. As you can see on the screen, that it specifies how much volume will be added to the grid through auctions in both the solar and wind domains. And this is, in total, this is more than 10 gigawatts of renewables. And for the first 3 years, there will be 1,000 megawatts coming from each wind and solar. And then afterwards, we will have every year coming 1,000 megawatts from solar technology. Moving on to what an auction entails. What is inside an auction? An auction is good because it is competitive, it is transparent, and it is efficient. An auction is also bad because it can have high administration costs. It can have underbidding, which leads to non-realization of projects. And it can also lead to concentration of projects, which means that one or few players dominate the market by taking up all of the volume. Now, both of these good and bad sides of auctions are potential. What actually happens as a result depends a lot on how you design the auction. That is one thing about auctions. The second thing about auctions is that they are very flexible. You can mold them and you can steer them in multiple directions. And which direction an auction goes, that depends on the goals which you are trying to accomplish. And this is where the goals and the priorities of the system comes in. And this is where national policy goals come in. And this is why we will be discussing these goals for Pakistan. Now, if you design an auction right, it results in many targets such as true price discovery. It can result in cost reduction. It can result in higher competition. It can result in targeted growth of a certain technology in a certain sector, in a certain region, and it can also result in local value creation. Now, when we look at global trends of auctions over the past decade, we see that the prices have gone down consistently. The auction award tariffs have gone down consistently over the past 10 years. Is this because of technology advancement or is this because of auctions? The graph on the right shows us that when we compare FITs versus auctions for the same country for the same year, we see that auctions still result in lower prices. They still result in lower tariffs. which indicates that auctions can drive down prices more than an FIT mechanism can. So yes, costs have gone down because of technology, but they have also gone down as a result of auctions. And auctions are able to drive down costs because of four major reasons. First of all, they increase the competition. Secondly, they result in true price discovery. Third, they focus on developing the market. And fourth, as a result of market development, the technology is enhanced over time. And through these four things, they are able to achieve cost reduction. So now we will focus our case on to the energy sector of Pakistan. In Pakistan, when we look at the past decade, we see that 78% cost reduction has been achieved already. We have gone from 14.7 cents per kilowatt hour to 3.25 cents per kilowatt hour for wind. And this particular tariff, 3.25 cents, was awarded by NEPRA but could not be realized. But if we take that next best case, 4.51 cents per kilowatt hour, this is still a substantial reduction. Similarly, in case of solar, we see that we have gone from 16.7 cents to 3.73 cents. Again, a massive reduction. When we look at the national policy objectives as present in the ARE policy and the national electricity policy, we see that least cost power generation is certainly a very important pillar of our priorities. But we also have other pillars such as market development and liberalization. We have enabling private sector participation, we have local manufacturing. And then on the environment and society side, we have energy security, something which is especially threatened under the current crisis of fuel shortages and dollar indexation. We also have to focus on environmental protection. We also have to keep social equity in check. We also have to, most importantly, look at the social and economic advancement through the investments of energy sector. Now, all of this goes to say that least cost is certainly a very important pillar, but that is not the only pillar. And what do we mean when we say we have to move beyond costs? We mean that we have to look at six factors while designing our auctions. First of all, we have to adapt our auctions to the specific market conditions. We have to foster social acceptability. We have to strengthen our domestic supply chains. We have to prevent domination of auctions by a few players, which is a very real threat. We have to reduce barriers to entry, and we have to promote domestic research and development, which is very important for strengthening the local market. Now, let me show you some examples globally, which countries have adopted in their practice for different goals. First of all, countries which have focused on an inclusive design and higher competition in fostering social acceptability. We see in Uruguay that project sizes were limited to 10 megawatts in 2006. The limit is increased to 20 megawatts in 2007, then up to 50 megawatts in 2009. And they are also limiting their projects to 50 megawatt for one bidder, then to 100 megawatt for one bidder, eventually in the later years. And these limitations are put in place, one, because they have limits on their geographic electric nodes, and secondly, because they want to disperse the benefits to multiple bidders, and they want to ensure that one bidder does not get all of the volume. In case of Spain, we see that they have in this year, in year 2022, they have put a limit of 180 megawatt per bidder. In Argentina, they have put limits of 1,200 megawatt in their Renewables Argentina program in 2017. In Germany, we see limits of 10 megawatt for solar PV projects. And we also see programs such as citizen projects in which there are more incentives for citizens, for ordinary citizens, and there are less qualification requirements. And despite doing all of this, when we look at data, for example, in Latin America, in countries which include Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, and Jamaica, we see that majority of their projects were less than 40 megawatt, as you can see in the first two bars. And only a small portion were more than 40 megawatts. But this still resulted in price reduction year after year after year. This all goes to show that this does not, such measures such as limiting the project size does not stop the price reduction. We have more examples from countries which focused on smooth implementation, which have set up dedicated entities at both national and regional levels. In Morocco, we can see the case of Mason, which was specifically focused on procuring solar and then later on also wind. In Argentina, we see Renewables Argentina program. In South Africa, we see the REI Tetra P program. In India, we see that almost 30 gigawatts of renewable energy are procured, and almost half of this is procured through state initiatives. And this goes to show how important it is to also focus on provincial policies. We have another practice of ensuring local content. In South Africa, we see that they mandated that 40% of construction content must be from local sources. In Brazil, 60% must be from local sources. Later on, they modified this and said that this local content requirement will only apply for loan requirements. So if you want loan from the government, you have to follow this mandate. In India, they set a 50% local content target, but then US launched a complaint with the World Trade Organization, and then they removed it, and now they are considering import duties on solar components to give a leeway to the internal market. Similarly, in Denmark, they put a limit of minimum 20% owners. That 20% owners must be from local, must be their citizens. So I will now focus on in more detail on the case of South Africa. In South Africa, we have their renewable energy program through auctions starting in 2013. And the fifth energy bid was floated in March of 2021. The program succeeded in procuring 2.58 gigawatts in just the fifth bid of solar and wind, with a total investment of $3.25 billion. And the entire program has resulted in procuring 6.4 gigawatts, which is a very large volume, and a total investment of $13.7 billion US dollars. The reason why we have decided to focus on South Africa more specifically is because of four factors. First of all, the case we see in South Africa is a case of auction design beyond just cost. This program is catering to multiple national development objectives, which include job creation, it includes social upliftment, it includes the development of the local industry, and the broadening of economic ownership. Secondly, they are focusing on the socio-economic development of the region. And for example, the IPPs are required to report on the initiatives they take and their contributions on the socio-economic improvement of the communities in which they operate. Then we have geographic distribution. South Africa also achieved a very good and uniform distribution across the country. And the major reason was that they have resources spread out over the entire country. But this also resulted in uniform distribution of the socioeconomic benefits. The fourth reason we have for picking South Africa is that they focused on domestic market and domestic shareholding. And they created a balance between the domestic financing and the foreign financing. And the domestic financing is important because when you have local investors, they tend to invest their dividends locally. And then you have value coming back to the local region, and it builds the community, results in local value creation, and strengthens the markets further, and so on. So in the 7 rounds that were conducted in Africa, we see a total of 6.4 gigawatts of capacity procured. And you can see that this is uniform procurement, because when you have uniform procurement, this sends out reliable signals to the market. This increases investor confidence, and this results in technology enhancement over time. Then we see that in case of South Africa, you have 60,000 job years being created for the local citizens. Then we also see that through this program, they mandated that at least 49% of the entities must be South African, and 30% of these entities must be Black South Africans. And as a result, you can see that they had 34% Black South African ownership of these projects. Then moving on, we see that they attracted foreign financing of 2.74 billion US dollars. And this was only 20% of the total financing. 80% of their financing came from local sources. And despite all of these measures, despite keeping in check all these national development goals, we see that their tariff still goes down year after year after year until they have a very low tariff of 1.03 rands per kilowatt hour. So I will leave you with some key takeaways in light of all the discussion we have had, that going forward with these auctions, there are 4 areas which we must not ignore as we carry out these auctions. The first area is an inclusive auction and a participatory market development. The second area is that we have to avoid dominance and concentration of the market and the auctions by one or few players. Third is that we have to make sure that the benefits are dispersed to multiple actors and multiple regions. And the fourth is that we have to prevent barriers to entry, or at least minimize barriers to entry. And once we do all of this, we will be able to make sure that our energy sector moves forward with all the goals in mind which the policymakers have set in place. I will end the presentation here. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can send them at info@renewablesfirst.com.pk. We will share the slides with you on the email address you have provided while registering. And I will pass on the discussion now to Mustafa Amjad, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Ammar. Quite insightful. Again, you kind of highlighted all of the challenges that a good auction mechanism can present as well, but all of the benefits that we stand of gaining through an auction design, an optimal auction design. So like you pointed out, we already have seen massive price reductions in Pakistan. Yes, we want a true price discovery. Yes, we want to drive that down further, but we also want to maximize these auctions to make sure that Pakistan's local industry, local developers are a part of this, value chains are created. So thank you for highlighting some global examples on that sense as well. Since we, I would again suggest that we do have a Q&A tab, and I would welcome all participants to please send in their questions. Ammar will try to answer those while we move to the panel discussion as well. And if you want to have them answered at the end, we also have a 10 to 15 minute designated Q&A session, but I would still welcome participants to please share their questions through the Q&A tab. We have a very loaded panel. We have a very distinguished panel, so I wouldn't want to take away any time from them. I would like to jump right into it. We would like to start with Mr. Oliver Knight, who's working as a senior energy specialist, South Asia Energy Unit at the World Bank. Oliver, pleasure as always. Again, first of all, congratulations on the successful report launch on VRE competitive bidding study. Yeah, it was quite insightful. It presented some great ideas for Pakistan as well with regards to auction design. So yeah, it provides a number of recommendations in terms of developing RE auctions market. I would like you to please shed some light on these recommendations. Please talk about how these factor in inclusive development for the RE industry in Pakistan. How does the World Bank perceive the RE auctions in Pakistan panning out? What are some of the ways that Pakistan can maximize its policy goals through these mechanisms? So over to you, Oliver.
Thanks. So thanks for inviting me to this webinar, and it's good to see so many people tuning in. As you said, we published a report on competitive bidding for variable renewable energy. That's essentially our shorthand for solar and wind. Last week, I will put the link into the chat shortly once I finish speaking, in case anybody hasn't seen that. And that report actually, that study was a 2-year effort carried out with Alternative Energy Development Board, It got quite delayed because of COVID and other things. Also, the multiple iterations of IGCEP, so we had to keep revising it. But we're happy with the final result, and there's a lot of detail in there with recommendations on how this should be carried out in Pakistan in an equitable way and trying to build the market, etc. Let me just give a few thoughts, and then maybe the purpose of this, I think, is a discussion. So I'd be keen to kind of react to some of the other panelists and maybe come back in later. But let me just give a few reactions on the paper. I think it's great to see this work. I think it's complementary to the work that we've done, and it's good to have people pushing and different recommendations in the sector and the discussion results. So congratulations for the paper that you're doing. And I think a lot of things in there are very consistent with what we're saying as well. I just was putting a few bullet points down. So I think it's important to recognize, in particular, in comparison to some of the other countries that were highlighted there, I think that, let's just take off the table. Competitive bidding is the way to go. So every country should be doing this. This is what we say across the countries we work in, and we're supporting many countries to do that. And I think there's no real discussion now on the merits of competitive bidding. It does have downsides, and one needs to be careful about that in the design. But essentially, this is the way forward. And maybe going beyond renewables or going beyond solar and wind in the medium term, there's no reason why plenty of things couldn't be done in a similar way. So let's put that kind of on the table. So the question here is, well, Pakistan is coming to competitive bidding quite late in the game compared to the other countries that were mentioned. And that actually provides quite a few advantages. So prices are already reasonably low in Pakistan with the last few tariffs that were announced by the regulator under the previous regime. So I think it's important to recognize that there may be a limited scope for big price reductions. That's not to say that prices can't go down further, but in particular, looking at the recent increases in OEM costs, so supply costs and the supply chain constraints being seen globally, I think we need to be a little cautious about looking for huge cost reductions or the kinds of tariffs that maybe you see in the Middle East, which are actually often due for other reasons, very, very low financing costs, for example. So bearing that in mind, why is competitive bidding still important to pursue? So firstly, it's a very efficient way to allocate projects to the best developers. And in particular, in this scale-up phase that we need to enter into in Pakistan. So the chart was presented showing the capacity additions outlined in IGCEP. There's around 10 gigawatts that need to come in on top of those that are already committed. Our view is that it should be much higher than that. If you look at optimal Plexus run, the modeling we did and published in November 2020, would see more like 20 gigawatts of solar and wind coming in. But there are political decisions in there. And the other thing to recognize, of course, is that right now the IGCEP is based on quite a lot of hydropower. Not all of that will necessarily come in on time. And so what is the best option for getting capacity in quickly? Well, it's solar and wind, in particular solar. So the way we see it is that solar and wind will essentially need to pick up the slack, any slack that comes about. But already there is a timeline in there that's quite aggressive, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, competitive bidding provides stability and confidence in the market, and I think the last speaker was referring to this. It's very important, particularly if you want to see those wider benefits in terms of job creation and domestic industry, etc., domestic supply chain and domestic investors. It's very important that there is confidence is built in the market, and that the developers can see the pipeline going forward. And the only way to do that is to publish a plan, is to then execute the plan, and then to build confidence by regular launching of competitive bidding rounds. There's no other way to do it. And in our view, and you'll see this in the report, the best way of encouraging local supply chain and local investment is through growth. It's through growth of the sector and by building the confidence that this is a place to invest and that there is a long-term pipeline in Pakistan that people can plan against. You can put in lots of additional requirements, but they will tend to push up the cost and may not achieve the desired result. And there's no shortcut. The country needs to get on with it and actually start implementing. And thirdly, competitive bidding, if well designed, can allow for a wide range of participants. Now, this brings us to one of the recommendations in the study we just published, which is that we believe there should be two types of competitive bidding done in the near term in Pakistan. One would be a substation-based competitive bidding. This is in particular appropriate for solar, although there may also be wind potential in this category, which is to look at substations where there is existing capacity to absorb new generation without major investment, and to identify that number in terms of capacity, and then essentially draw a line around that substation and say, anybody that can bring in a project around this substation up to the capacity that we need can come into this competitive bidding round. And essentially, if you do that for multiple substations across the country, one can get a very large amount of capacity without any need for major investment in transmission and distribution. And the second to last study that we published is actually looking exactly at this. So the variable renewable energy location study, which you can also download. I can put the link for that as well. That actually shows that you can meet 20% of Pakistan's power generation capacity just by mopping up essentially the spare capacity in existing substations. The second category of competitive bidding that we believe needs to happen is more around renewable energy parks. So this is larger scale, strategically identified areas or zones in the country. Most of those would be in Sindh and Balochistan. And this is where a government needs to play a more active role by identifying those areas and then potentially building or getting others to build the shared infrastructure, and then essentially holding competitive bidding for projects within those larger parks. And this has been very successful in India and other countries, and is something that we believe has huge potential here, particularly to get to the longer term targets that the country has set. So my final thing, and I've kind of been saying it already a few times, it's really critical that Pakistan now starts competitive bidding as soon as possible. To meet the 2024 target in IGCEP, competitive bidding must start in 2022 to have any chance of meeting that. And that's for new capacity. That's in addition to the category 3 projects that AEDB is intending to do competitive bidding on this year as well. So this is not a situation where the country can sit back and wait and see what happens. In fact, the current power crisis really emphasizes the role that renewables could be playing right now if there had been more renewables on the system, because the fuel price has gone up, as everybody knows, and the country would be benefiting hugely if it had actually made some of these investments earlier. Now, we are where we are, but the critical thing now is to look to the future. I don't think anybody expects this instability in fuel prices and in energy insecurity could certainly be with us for many years. So it's very, very important now to start investing in this, and to meet those IGCEP targets, you've got to start this year. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Oliver. So just a quick follow-up. So how frequently do you think Pakistan should be conducting these auctions, and should these mechanisms be revised? So should we progressively update them to respond to the market? So if we conduct the auctions this year, should we think about revising them in the next, or perhaps after a couple of cycles?
Yeah, so I think firstly, the answer to that first question is IGCEP is pretty clear that you essentially need to be adding a certain amount of capacity every year. That means essentially probably one round of competitive bidding every year as a minimum, potentially 2 rounds if you split them. So you may have a substation-based round, and then you may want to do a park-based round. So that would be 2 per year. Probably in the near term, you're looking at substation base just to mop up all that capacity that exists before those larger projects. Those larger projects are going to need a bit more time to develop, particularly in Balochistan. So they can come in later. And in the near term, there's a lot of places potentially where solar and maybe wind can be put without the need for major upgrades. So yearly, I think, is the answer to that. And in terms of tweaking, I think we cover this in the report, but it's good to have a bit of stability. So our take would be that at least for the next few years, come up with a regime, implement it, unless there are major problems, keep implementing that regime, and then maybe in a few years, do a consultation, see what can be improved, and implement that in the next few rounds. But for the time being, the important thing is to build some confidence, because people have been talking about solar and wind competitive bidding in this country now for about 5 years, and it hasn't happened. And so international investors in particular, but probably also local investors, many of those will have lost a lot of confidence that this is ever going to happen. So the important thing now is to actually implement, build that confidence, not tinker with the thing too much, and have a very regular cycle so that people know whatever the month is, whether it's October or April, people know that this is going to be happening every year on a fixed cycle.
Thank you so much, Oliver. We'll circle back to you, hopefully, for the Q&A session as well. Our next panelist that I would like to invite is Dr. Fatima Khusnood, who's currently working as the Vice President at Engro Energy Limited. Dr. Fatima has extensive experience with corporate finance, power sector advisory roles, infrastructure finance, consulting, academics, research and training. She's also a privatization specialist, a practitioner, trainer, and a consultant. Dr. Fatima has a PhD in finance from University of Western Australia. She has almost 2 decades of rich experience spanning across various sectors, such as banking, hospitality, telecommunications, and capital markets. She was previously working as the GM of Business Development in Engro Energy, but has recently been promoted as the Vice President at Engro. So pleasure to have you here with us, Dr. Fatima. My question to you would be, obviously shifting from tariffs to competitive bidding, it is a major transformation for Pakistan. It is quite a change, and that means that there is a need to create enabling conditions for investors. And as Oliver also pointed out, we need a clear, focused, time-bound plan with very clear roadmaps to achieve these national targets. So in this light, what are some of your suggestions to perhaps ensure de-risking of investment for the renewable energy sector? And also, I would also like to hear your opinion on should Pakistan adopt multiple auction routes before converging on a mutually feasible option, or as Oliver pointed out, we can perhaps, we need more stability right now than experiments at this front.
Great. Thank you so much, Mustafa. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us here today, and thank you for having me. I think you're absolutely right. As much as we are transitioning towards the competitive tariff regimes and to the entire energy sector in Pakistan is actually going through a major transformation, whether it's on account of renewables or in terms of moving from a single buyer model to a wholesale market. So a lot happening right now. And yes, I think the more important thing to think about is the investor confidence, which clearly is the backbone for any transition or any transformation for any country. What I would like to highlight here, especially from the de-risking concept, is we actually need to focus on 3 major things. I think the very foremost thing, especially for Pakistan, and it's kind of unfortunate that we as investors always struggle, is the consistency of policies. I think that is one thing which we are never sure of because the policies only live as long as the government lives. And when the new government comes in, the new policy comes in. So as an investor, you're never sure if what you are signing up for today is going to be honored or is going to be actually valid if your political government changes. And considering the political instability that we face very often in Pakistan, this is something which makes our country very risky. And what really happens, why am I saying that consistency of policies is important? Because as an investor, you actually price the risk. And considering that when you are talking about the policies which are actually the backbone of whatever you're getting into in such transactions or in such investments, I think you eventually end up having a higher risk premium for countries like Pakistan, because you're never sure what you're signing up today will, that will be honored, one, or whether that'll be renegotiated, or whether you'll be forced uh, uh, to a very new environment which you are totally unknown of. So whenever you have an unknown demon in the investment environment, you always price it higher, and that makes it more risky. And obviously uh, uh, an element of risk premium is attached there. So I think the first and the foremost thing that we need to do is to ensure that consistency of policies is there if you want to have the favorable investment climate. Then sanctity of contracts, that's again very important. Again, in Pakistan, we have seen contracts to be signed and locked and then reopened for renegotiation. That again bring in an element of uncertainty. And when there is uncertainty, the element of risk goes high. So that's another thing that we need to focus on, that we need to ensure that in the hindsight, whatever contract has been signed by the government needs to be honored, irrespective of the change in hands in the political scheme of things. Third, I think Oliver very rightly pointed out stability and enabling environment. That again plays a very important role for an investor to have that confidence that this is the country that they would like to invest in. These are the three major things which I feel play a very important role when we talk about de-risking the investments. Especially talking about this renewables, from renewables standpoint, I think we need to move towards regionally competitive tariffs, because that's something which is very important. Again, at the moment, we are sitting in a generation excess environment, and as much as we are focusing on adding in more generation assets, we need to be very mindful that unless demand creation is there, we are looking at idle generation capacity, which again is going to increase the risk for our investors. When we talk about the renewable, existing renewable projects that we have, curtailment and transmission constraints is another very big issue that needs to be taken care of if we want to invite or attract more investment. Similarly, I think financing, on the financing end, although State Bank has a lot of favorable policies, maybe the local banks need to offer some financial instruments. Green bonds can be one example, and they have to come up with some more innovative methods when it comes to financing these projects. And one very important thing when we talk about de-risking investments is, especially, I think Oliver mentioned about the commodity pricing, the way it's going, and we all know that it's not going to change in near future. There's a lot of uncertainty. We are facing a lot of supply chain constraints. And the only way to address that is to ensure that we have localization of equipments by the EPCs. So maybe we need to bring in the industry and start thinking about making these equipments locally to decrease our reliance, or to address our excessive reliance on international supply chain for the procurement of these products. So I think that's another thing that we need to focus on when we talk about the investment climate for Pakistan. Talking about the second part of the question, I think as much as it's important to experiment when we are starting off with something which is very new for the country, it's very important to go for bite-sized experimentation. And I would totally agree and rather echo what Oliver was saying in terms of substation-based bidding, because considering the intensive investment you need in the transmission, it's very important that for starters we go for substation based bidding. That will ensure that we utilize our existing transmission infrastructure to the best, and we do not have any surplus in that. And obviously park based is another that we can look at. So perhaps the best way to go about it is to pilot an auction, and then utilize the learnings, because once we pilot, we'll have a lot of teething issues. So there'll be a good case for us to learn from them, adopt, and then come up with something which is more friendly for the environment, and that will ensure that we get enough participation in terms of our investments. Similarly, I think another very important thing that we can do is to link it with the SGDs. So to make sure it's more inclusive in terms of economic uplift. And Ammar also mentioned that's one of the way forward areas or food for thought that he left on the table was the economic uplift. So I think that's another very important thing. If we can link these investments with socio-economic improvement for the local communities within the auction areas, that can again help us in making such auctions more successful. One or two more things that I would like to highlight is that it's very important to engage with the key stakeholders, especially for countries like Pakistan, where auctions is something which is very new. So you need a lot of awareness, and webinars like we are having right now are an excellent starting point for such things. We need to involve all the stakeholders so we can have all the discussions and address all the apprehensions while we are in the process. Here, I would also like to give a word of caution. I think the auction design, bidding documents, and the documents can benefit from the best practice templates, but tailoring them to the individual auction, especially for a country like Pakistan, which is unique, is also very important. I cannot emphasize enough that market building helps bidders to prepare for the auction. Oliver also said that we need to have these auction manuals, timelines ahead of time, so everybody is very clear and ready. Perhaps it's important to involve all the right stakeholders in the draft versions of the participation documents to ensure that their skin is in the game. And I think last but not the least, communication is the key. So as much as we think we are ready, communication barriers should not be there. We should always be talking to the key stakeholders. Perhaps such awareness sessions, seminars, and all such relevant forums should be available where we can address our concerns both from the developers and from the government and from the implementers side. Again, I think we need to take a lot of measures when we talk about these ensuring that these auctions are not really in the hands of few buyers. So we need to or few developers. So we maybe when we talk about the substation based bidding, we also need to be very sure that we have the megawatts that we are putting up for auctions can attract more players rather than only focusing on the players which have more financial muscle. So I think these are a couple of things that we should club in when we are talking about the auction routes. But I would actually echo what Oliver was saying, that for starters, substation-based bidding and park-based bidding is the way to. And we can improvise while we are going. And sorry, I can go on, but I'll stop here because we have a power-packed panel. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Dr. Fatma. Again, great suggestions. I guess it's quite evident that any auctions mechanism without having the RE developer sector's opinion on board, their preferences, because as Oliver pointed out, as Ammar also mentioned, it's been almost 5 years since we've been waiting for this, and we need to ensure that whatever auction mechanism we come up with is very inclusive, it is very clear, it is very transparent, so that again, I see a lot of the private developers as attendees of the session as well. So it is great to see that there is a lot of enthusiasm with regards to this, but we also need to make sure that whatever final plan we come up with is very clear. It has clear timelines, clear ambitions, so that and consistency, as you mentioned, we can't link this to political turmoils in the country. They need to be separated. So thank you for all your inputs. I would like to move on to a more international perspective with Dr. Vikas Kruger. Dr. Kruger, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, as Ammar also mentioned in his presentation, the case of South Africa is pretty unique. And we know that your experience isn't limited to South Africa. You have almost over 14 years of experience, and you specialize in power sector investment. You've written lots of papers, published a lot of work on auction design and their peculiarities across the globe. So yeah, we're looking forward to your valuable insight during this session. So my question is specifically, keeping in mind Asian, African, and the Latin American work that you have done, what are the various auction design elements that could affect price and investment outcomes, particularly say auction volumes, frequency, auction types, ceiling prices, the lot. So how would you recommend that Pakistan as a country should start with this process? And how can we, improve this, ensure that we maximize the benefits of it and not fall under, all the pitfalls that Ammar also highlighted in this presentation? So over to you, Dr. Vikas.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this webinar. I have to say it's been really interesting for me just listening to the presentation so far and kind of picking up the parallels between Pakistan and South Africa at the moment. I think both countries are struggling to deal with energy crises. There's been substantial kind of policy uncertainty in the energy space. It's a highly contested space in South Africa, at least at the moment, and has been for the past 5 years. And I think what's been notable for me is if I look at the price trends in Pakistan that you showed earlier, it's actually very encouraging to see that you've achieved these reductions kind of in the absence of a competitive mechanism, which shows that there is a really strong kind of regulatory agency in the country that's able to accurately or relatively well, accurately kind of figure out what the cost elements are of these different technologies. But even in that scenario, I think there are clear advantages to auctions, as Oliver pointed out. So maybe let me start by just saying I think South Africa offers lots of lessons, both kind of good and bad, in terms of auction design and implementation. I'm going to be talking primarily from South Africa's experience, but we also do work analyzing auctions in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Latin America. We've looked at India as well, trying to understand how do you kind of design these and implement these auctions to secure low prices and project realization, which is the two kind of main objectives, I think, in our context. But there are obviously other objectives as well, and I can speak a little bit about those later. But I think one of the first things to note is that when it comes to designing auctions, there are often very important trade-offs to consider. And these trade-offs are, play out in various ways. And so from a design perspective, they often require political decisions, not only kind of technical decisions as well. But in terms of specific elements, I think the one thing that South Africa offers as a lesson is, one, when you first go to market, do not put too much volume out in your first bidding round. So South Africa, I think, put more than 3,000 megawatts out in its first initial bidding window. We call it, or bidding round, we call it bidding windows in South Africa. At that stage, the timelines between the kind of RFP being released and the bidding deadline was quite short. The other thing that was playing a role there was qualification requirements. So every project, every wind project, for example, had to have 12 months of wind data logged. For solar projects, it was 10 years of data. That requirement, alongside requirements such as permits, locked-in financing, etc., meant that there were very few projects that were ready to bid by that submission deadline, and we ended up with really high tariffs. They're actually higher than the feed-in tariffs were at that stage, which were already quite generous. So I think if I could make a first recommendation, it would be that maybe Pakistan should start with a slightly smaller volume. I think it was a great idea to look at the substations that are currently available, as was suggested by Oliver and Dr. Fatima, and and kind of test the market response and kind of ramp up volumes from there. So volume would be the first one. The second is frequency of the bids. Again, as has been said multiple times now, consistency, clarity, giving bidders a kind of a clear timeline in terms of when bidding rounds will happen, but also when certain things within the bidding process will happen is key and reduces risks and subsequently costs over each round. And so again, trying to have at least one round per year, I think would be best practice at the very least. Again, and then making sure that sustains itself. I think one thing that wasn't shown in the actual presentation on South Africa was that in 2015, our bidding program was stopped effectively. And it was done so because Eskom, which is our vertically integrated power utility and the single buyer of these projects, perceived itself as being threatened by the private sector coming in and bidding at that stage tariffs that were at or below Eskom's average cost of supply. And so Eskom's leadership refused to sign the power purchase agreements, the offtake agreements. And that persisted for 3 or 4 years. And then when that obviously caused harm in the market and reduced investor confidence. But it also, very importantly, it caused several factories that have been set up to shut down. We lost jobs and skills in the sector. And so now, when we started rebidding, only I think last year, opening up the bidding program again, it's been quite a story to get all these skills, all the capacity up and running again. And for example, South Africa's local content localization programs have now kind of been out of whack. So government's requirements in terms of local content is still based on a mindset from 6-7 years ago, whereas we've lost a lot of capacity in the intervening years, and that's making it very difficult for projects to deliver. So consistency is not only about the frequency of projects, but trying to retain some level of political commitment to the program, even when you have changes in administration or even within the current political economy of what is Pakistan and the kind of power relations between decision makers and key role players. And in that sense, I think making sure that the key role players are involved from the start in the design of the program, that they are bought in, that they have some stake, some skin in the game. In countries like Namibia, for example, you see the off-taker utility actually taking equity in the projects being awarded, in that way kind of aligning its incentives with that of the private sector. Seeing similar things in Zambia. So that's another important thing to consider. And then I think when it comes to ceiling prices, I think it's kind of neither here nor there. South Africa used to have ceiling prices in its first bidding round, and we saw when that happened, and when we had these low volumes of bids, that bidders were basically bidding at those ceiling levels, and that caused very high prices. Whereas in later rounds, where we had much more competition, 3, 4, 5 times the volume that's requested being bid, we could remove ceiling prices without needing to worry that prices were going to rise above those ceilings. So I think it's probably prudent to set some level of ceiling price at the start, although it's not necessarily you don't need to make that public, but that price needs to be realistic. We've unfortunately seen examples in East Africa where government, for example, saw prices coming out of really competitive bidding programs internationally. They set ceiling prices at very low levels, considering that country's risk profile, and they didn't get any realistic bids. And so it remains a key risk, I think, that the auction designers need to be aware of. And then just in terms of qualification requirements, I think something that the South African program is probably uniquely done, and I have to say South Africa has been remarked on several times by developers as probably being the most onerous and costly program to bid into. But what happened when the program was being designed is government is really worried about getting new capacity onto the system, and we desperately needed more power. And so a lot of effort and priority was given to getting projects basically financial close ready at the point of bidding. So projects needed to have land secured, all their permits, everything in place, including crucially financing. So the banks, local South African banks, as well as the international banks that wanted to participate, actually reviewed the contracts prior to the bidding process being opened. And then once the bidding process was open, these contracts were non-negotiable. And that ensured that the banks actually had to do substantial due diligence on the projects. And so it kind of outsources due diligence function away from the procuring entity itself, which still did a level of due diligence, but not necessarily to the same depth, and actually ensure that we had really high realization rates. I think of the 92 projects that have been awarded, only one has not reached financial close. So those are the key issues around, I think, price and realization. Maybe just one comment around economic development and socioeconomic development. I think South Africa is both an example of kind of good practice in this sense, but also there are some lessons that we can learn here. And I think one thing that has been notable is that just to be clear, South Africa, apart from kind of ownership requirements and local content requirements, we also require projects to invest heavily in the local communities. We require them to procure their goods and services from specifically Black-owned enterprises, women-owned enterprises, etc. In many cases, what we've kind of done is outsourced many of government's developmental roles to the private sector, often just to engineers that are trying to build a power plant. And that comes with a lot of difficulties. And I think it's not always the best way of doing this. I think projects do need local community buy-in, and they need to benefit local communities. But I also think there is a much bigger role for especially local government to play in ensuring local development and ensuring that revenue flows from these projects are channeled into the kind of correct places and needs and priorities. And so, unfortunately, in South Africa, we've often seen projects, for example, being in a certain location, and because of their requirements, they would, build a school or a hospital without that being in line with what the local community requires, because there is no requirement from government that needs to align. And so that's another, just a really important point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kruger. Again, thank you for all your interventions. There are obviously lots of lessons for Pakistan to learn from South Africa as well. And again, as you mentioned, Ammar also kind of alluded to this. There are a lot of similarities between South Africa and Pakistan, where we are at a national level as well with the energy prices and the energy crisis. So thank you for comparing the parallels and highlighting some of the lessons that could be translated. I would request that if you could please stay around for the Q&A session as well. We also have, say, the Keel Hussain Jaffrey, who is Director Policy of the AEDB in Pakistan. But Keel Sahab, if you don't mind, I would like to come back to you at the end. I would first like to hand it over to Sohaib Sahab so that we can get all the opinions of different players and then move to the regulator for a more optimal response from your end. So Sohaib, if you are available, let me briefly introduce Sohaib before that. He's working as the principal analyst at energy transition practice at Mackenzie. Sohaib manages Woodmac's wind market research in Northern and Western Europe, the Middle East and South Africa. He's also focused on market developments, future scenarios, supply chain dynamics, and competitive strategies across the wind power value chain. So I kind of saved the best question for you, Sohaib. Given the current political global scenario, we are seeing that the basket prices of energy in Pakistan are quite high. Fuel prices after the Russian invasion of Ukraine are also, and Pakistan heavily relies on the spot market. So the prices of fuels are quite high. A good auctions mechanism in this scenario means that Pakistan has the ability to drive the growth for RE sector and ensure a transition effectively towards renewables from fossil-based energy. So what are some of the lessons perhaps that Pakistan can learn from? Using again examples of similar cases. And I would also like your opinion on the price only award criteria. Is it something that could work in Pakistan, or do we need something more focused or more dedicated?
Great, thank you very much, Mustafa. Just let me know if I miss any of the questions while I'm commenting. But before I start, I would like to thank Ammar for an excellent presentation. So I think, and then the comments from our fellow panelists, from Dr. Kruger, Oliver, and Dr. Fatima, I think they've pretty much, summed up a lot of stuff that I could speak about. So I apologize for redundancy, which is pretty much unavoidable, I would say. So coming to your questions, I think there is a couple of things that I would like to highlight. So from a government perspective, if you look at, as a policymaker, I think there are a couple of things that I would like to highlight and then speak about. First thing is that for Pakistan as a government, for its policymakers, the first most important thing for me is to really take stock of what they offer or what they can offer. What are the countries where they can learn from? So is it Saudi Arabia, the UAE of the world, or is it the South Africas or the Moroccos of the world? Who are the countries that we should look towards in terms of similarities that we have between Pakistan and those countries, and how we can benefit from their learning experience? There's a lot has been said, I think, about South Africa, and Dr. Kruger has spoken about that, and also Ammar talked about the country. There's a couple of things that I would like to highlight as well about South Africa in terms of similarities. There's a lot of similarities, as was noted earlier. That is one thing. The other thing then would be, if we are talking about auctions, what is really government's priority, what it wants to achieve from those auctions. So those are the two things I think I would look into a bit more details. So I think let's start off with, what do you offer as a government, as Pakistan, like what sort of resources that we have as a country, as policymakers, what is really at the disposal of our government? Because when we are speaking about auctions, we are talking about large infrastructure projects, right? We're talking about hundreds of megawatts or maybe gigawatts of renewable energy capacity being procured through this mechanism. And of course, this is something which would need infrastructure, grid infrastructure, etc., for its evacuation. So if we look at Pakistan and we look at the resources that the government has at its disposal, I think they don't have a lot of resources like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, right? Because if you look at the model that the Saudi government has followed for its solar and wind energy auctions, it is pretty clear that these parks were pre-developed, right? Some money was spent by these governments to get the sites, ready for bid. That's something that was done in these countries. It has helped them, I would say, in terms of driving the cost of this electricity down when these projects are up and running. But in terms of Pakistan, I think from our own experience and also looking at the scarcity of resources that we have at the government's disposal, I think that may not be a really wise sort of strategy from my standpoint and how I see it. I think the countries that we could, learn lessons from or more, in my opinion, they have to be like South Africa, they have to be Morocco, where you are allowing developers to identify sites. They are spending their own money. So then you are looking at, a much bigger project pipeline. That was also something that was mentioned earlier. I fully second that opinion, because in terms of having large project pipeline, this is something that really helps you have better competition in the market in terms of price, in terms of different indicators or your own priorities, right, as a government, what you want to achieve. Then we come towards, as a government, right, what you want to achieve for the economy, for the power sector, and to really decarbonize your energy and economy sectors, like all encompassing. I'm talking about that. So if you're focusing only on, let's say, like the power sector, and then you're talking only about prices, I think, yeah, maybe it would make sense for someone to talk only about prices. But as a country, and also looking at its macroeconomic situation and also the needs going forward, I think there is a need for us to really think into not only the short-term needs of the country and the economy, but also the long-term aspects of an auction program, right? Because again, like talking about renewable energy auctions, talking about large-scale projects, you're talking about an industry, because now, I mean, there are a lot of opportunities that you could go down that path, right? If you come up with an excellent project, excellent auction plan, and then you move forward with that. I would take cue from Dr. Kruger's comments when you're talking about, like consistency. There is enough volume in the market. There is that sort of credibility of the auctioning agencies or agents, right? So once you have that, then it really allows you to develop new industries. But at this moment, be it solar, be it wind, I think the government of Pakistan, once it moves forward with auctions, it should not be focused too much on supply chain issues in terms of localization. In my opinion, that has to be a sort of, evolutionary process, right? Once you're getting started, then you have to sort of give that sort of confidence, or to really win the confidence of the industry, so that it's not only you who is pushing for them to come and localize, but you're also sort of incentivizing them to come in and establish the industry in the country. Because I think one thing that we have seen, I won't name any country, frankly, but there is a lot of way-arounds, like when we see there is local content requirements that are being set, the investors and developers and the industry, they always find a way out of that. They know how to do that. But I think in terms of strictly enforcing those regulations, that also is, I mean, if it becomes a really sort of bureaucratic process, I think that really is a recipe for an inefficient mechanism. So that's something should be avoided. It should rather be, like that sort of mechanism where you are incentivizing the industry to come and establish their manufacturing in the country. But at present, when you speak about, like these two major sources of renewable energy, namely solar and wind, you look at the supply chain, the turbine OEMs, and also across the supply chain for wind energy, they are not in a good shape in terms of their finances, in terms of their operational efficiencies. Whereas for solar, yes, you could say that. But again, like the sort of scale that has been achieved in Southeast Asia in terms of manufacturing, I think it would be pretty difficult for anyone to come to Pakistan and then have their, establish their local supply chain in Pakistan, purely because of economic reasons or commercial reasons, right? So I think for them, we have seen India, for instance, over the last couple of years, they were focused pretty much on localizing solar PV manufacturing. They also introduced pretty high duties, like import duties, but to no avail. I mean, it hasn't really achieved the results that the government wanted to achieve. So I think from that perspective, if we have that sort of, like, let's say talking about 20-30%, we're talking about several gigawatts of auctions that will be executed in the country over the last 10-15 years. This is the sort of, this sort of way forward that I would suggest. Then, talking about two different mechanisms in terms of, like Oliver mentioned, that the World Bank has proposed substation-based auctions and then renewable energy parks. So my understanding would be, like when you're talking about substation, a kind of auction mechanism, this is something, like that really helps you grow. So first of all, what you have to do from the government or from the NTPC's perspective, you really have to share with the different stakeholders that, okay, so we've got X gigawatt or X 100 megawatts available here and there. And then this is going to be the developers, early stage developers, who have to invest in sites and then develop them, etc., and then use that capacity, right, for their renewable energy projects. Whereas talking about renewable energy parks, then, conventionally, then we are talking about pretty large scale projects, right, of several hundred megawatts. We've seen that in Central Asia. I would say there are some concerns in terms of transparency when it comes to large scale projects, because when we're talking only about government to government kind of projects, etc., or auctions, even in that regard. So there is, these sort of mechanisms are pretty much tilted towards very large player. very large players. And this is something that does not help to a large extent in terms of, like having a pretty large project pipeline, because the investors, the developers are always looking towards, towards governments to really foot the bill, or maybe, like offer them some sort of support. So yeah, I think to sum my comments in terms of short term, Mustafa, to your second question, I think in short term, I think pricing mechanism, having focused on prices, I think it is important, right? To what extent it should be, I think the numbers are pretty clear. The sort of digression that we have, even in feed-in tariff or cost-plus regime, whatever we call it, in Pakistan, that has been pretty phenomenal. We have seen those prices coming down. It was done by the regulator. Developers were willing to develop those projects and install them at that rate, despite the fact that we never had auctions in this country. But I think going forward, I would certainly say that we really need to think, or in an integrated manner, like how we are going to link renewable energy towards like propping up or helping build a new industry in the country, how we will be doing that, and then at a larger scale, like decarbonization of the whole economy. So with that, I would like to conclude. If I missed any of your questions, please let me know.
Thank you so much, Zohaib. Always a pleasure. Again, lots of questions, but I guess we are running out of time. So I would like to move on to, I guess, our most important panelist for the day, Saeed Akhil Hussain Jafri Saab from AEDB. Akhil Saab is working as the Director Policy at the institution. He has almost over 14 years of experience with AEDB. And yeah, again, we know that AEDB is designing these auction mechanisms. They are a crucial player of all of this. We've had lots of questions with regards to when are we going to start with the auction. So Akhil Saab, if you could start with that question, and then if you could also talk about, the design that Pakistan is foreseeing with regards to auctions. What are your goals through this mechanism? How do you want this whole thing to pan out? What are the expected results that you are looking at, and how are you planning to achieve that? And also the cost question as well, because we do see that the levelized cost of wind and solar in the Asia Pacific region has gone up by almost 21% during the last year. Technology costs, supply chain disruptions. So even for India, we saw an increase of almost 8%. So how do you think, can we drive this cost down further through auctions, or maybe it's time to, think about other goals? And yeah, but like Say mentioned, cost is important, but at the same time, let's maximize the utility, because I believe all the panelists, all the attendees might also agree that auctions is the way to forward. There is consensus toward that, but what should be the design? Could you shed some light on that, please?
Thank you, Mustafa. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all the participants. Yes, I think every panelist has mentioned that the auctions is the way forward, especially for the development of renewable energy sector in Pakistan, as is being done globally. And it is indeed a fact that the prime driver for the interest in auctions of government of Pakistan, as for the other countries, has been to achieve the cost efficiency in development of RE projects, and it also at the same time price discovery of renewable energy based electricity, and to potentially avoid the windfall profits and underpayments. But I believe for a country like Pakistan, the auctions also possess several other advantages. I think, as you mentioned at the onset, that the design of the auction will play a critical role. And I think a well-designed auction can provide a level playing field for all local and international investors, and can provide a fair competition for all, compared with the unsolicited mode that we've had so far, in which only a select investors could participate in the project development. Secondly, I think auctions would attract a more number of investors, and especially the international investors. And then with that, they can bring in their international exposure and international know-how to the Pakistani market, that on the basis of which we can further, as it was being mentioned, that by gaining experience with a couple of cycles, we will have to revise our auction processes and the designs, in order to achieve more efficiency in the auction process. But that can only be achieved with the participation of international actors and more international investors. I think one other factor which is also suggested in the study carried out by World Bank, as Oliver mentioned, so far we have seen the development of projects in the capacity range of 50 to 100 megawatts. There were many reasons for that. But going forward, the auctions will provide a good, I think, platform for developing large-scale parks, especially in the range of 200 to 500 megawatts, especially if the demand goes up and in the future iterations of IGCEP, the requirements for capacity addition through renewable is increased, then we will have to go towards park-based development, and the auctions, I think, are a better way of developing large-scale projects compared to the substation-based competitive bidding or even the unsolicited mode. One other thing that, although as you mentioned that the prices of renewable energy projects, the capacity, the investment cost, and especially the commodity, due to increase in commodity prices, the prices are going up, especially in the last year or so. But we believe that the auctions would compel the investors to go and look for better financing, cheap financing, and negotiate good, better deals with the lenders in order to compete with other participants in the auction process. So there still would be margins for reduction in the tariffs for wind and solar projects compared to unsolicited and upfront tariff modes. Another important aspect is that the auctions provide a better way to regulate the project development, especially for Pakistan, in which we have the IGCEP targets in place, the policy targets in place, and the capacity requirements under the IGCEP. So we can, in order to achieve these targets, I think auctions are a better way as compared to other modes of project development. And in future, we can also go for technology neutral auctions, which might also be more suitable for the wholesale electricity market regime that is being introduced under the CTBCM. And I think most importantly, the project development, the auctions, one other benefit the auctions have is that which we foresee based on our experience of development of wind and solar projects in Pakistan in the last 10 years, that the project development period would certainly reduce as compared to what we've seen in the unsolicited cost plus mode or even the upfront tariff mode, because all the necessary approvals or the documents, non-negotiable documents, as Mr. Kruger also mentioned, that they will be the part of the RFP package. So I think for the developers, it will also build more confidence that the necessary approvals and consents and all the documents that are part of the project development are placed in front of them at the time of when the auctions are initiated. And once the bidding process is finalized and the successful bidder is evaluated, then it's only a matter of signing the agreements and doing the financial close and going in construction. And I think other benefits, as mentioned by the participants, that job creation is one other benefit that we want to achieve, and localization would also be an evolutionary process that once we have a consistency in auctions being conducted every year based on certain targets coming from the IGCEP and the policy, I think that will also attract investors to come and invest in the manufacturing of RE equipment. We are already in the process of developing a policy. In fact, we are supporting the Engineering Development Board. They are coming up with a policy for manufacturing of PV panels in Pakistan. But I think a good market in the future with interest of investors and a successful competitive bidding process, conduct of a successful bidding process, that is very essential for attracting anyone to come and invest in manufacturing of equipment in Pakistan. Lastly, your point regarding what are the AEDB's plan to go with for the auctions. Well, as Oliver mentioned, to start off, we will be conducting the competitive bidding for the category 3 projects, the pipeline projects of the RE policy 2006, and we plan to initiate the bidding process by end of June or start of July. That is basically, if we define mode wise, that would be a substation based bidding. But in future, by the end of this, we are already working on preparing the RFP packages and concession agreements for the competitive bidding under the new ARE policy that will be open for all the investors, and that we target to initiate that by end of this year or early next year. As I think before that, the revised IGCEP for 2022 would also be approved, and we will have more clarity on what quantum of wind and solar needs to be inducted in the system. So that's the latest from our side. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up, Vakil sir, because you also mentioned in the last part of your, so the new IGCEP is expected and would obviously add more clarity. So do you think, given the current energy crisis with regards to, imported fuel and the spot market prices, do you think the share of wind and solar might be going up? Would that mean, obviously, if that happens, would that mean that we would be looking at more frequent or higher volumes for our auctions?
I think increasing oil prices is one factor, but the prime factor that would affect the share of renewables would be the timelines of the committed large hydro projects. So if any of the large hydro slips from the 2030 timeline, then that differential would certainly be catered for from wind and solar.
Thank you so much, Afisab. Again, I guess we are almost out of time, but we would definitely still like to answer a few questions. I would like to start with you, since we have this question as well. And we know India has a very aggressive clean hydrogen policy. Is AEDB working on that front as well? Is that something that you think Pakistan can further exploit through policy making and a clear plan for that?
Hydrogen, there's no such policy making in the process right now, because I think hydrogen is a cross-sectoral thing, because when we talk about hydrogen, and generally globally, the term of hydrogen economy is discussed because it has linkages with transportation sector, it has linkages with the commercial sector. Hydrogen for power generation is only one part of the equation. So it has to be a wholesome policy. We do have had interactions in the recent part with some international developers who are looking and are interested in investing in Pakistan for development of hydrogen-based generation projects and utilization of hydrogen in the commercial sector as well. But for that, I think wholesome and cross-cutting policy needs to be devised. That will certainly include participation and regulation by the petroleum side as well, and climate change ministry would also be involved, because one of the aspects of the policy would be setting the price for the hydrogen that goes beyond the mandate of AEDB.
Well, thank you so much. I think let's move on to the Q&A session now. We also have Adnan Tapalsa has his hand raised for quite some while. If the admin could please allow him to ask his question. Tapalsa, you can unmute yourself and please ask your question from the panel, please.
Sorry, I didn't have a specific question, but yeah, I'd like to just on Oliver's comment about the Sindh government auction. So I believe this is being funded by the World Bank, which is great. And he mentioned that the timelines for the RFP to be circulated would be within the next 3 to 4 months. I just wanted to confirm that the understanding is correct.
I mean, we're not implementing that project, so it's not the timeline is out of our hands. But my understanding is that's the intention. I guess it could slip a little bit, but certainly it should certainly come out this year. There's, the work is ongoing. Some sites have been identified, and just to be clear, there are actually 2 processes within that project now. One is a site that's included in IGCEP, which is a 50 megawatt site near Manchand in Jamshoro district. And the other is a new series of sites through a collaboration between the Sindh Energy Department, K Electric, and the World Bank for sites near to Karachi on public land that would be identified for the project. So that process is ongoing of trying to secure that land. And then, so the off-taker for that second batch, which is actually much larger, is KE, which is why those sites are not in the IGCEP, because KE in the last IGCEP was outside it. And going forward, the project could continue to do that. It could continue to have federal offtake sites and KE offtake sites, depending on the demand. As I said, though, the bank is just financing the project. We're actually, the main thing right now we're financing is a transaction advisor. If there's a need for some infrastructure, some public infrastructure, we can finance that as well. And that's just being decided right now as to what the public sector should do and what the private sector should do. But the competitive bidding will be organized by the transaction advisor, and it will be to international standards, and it'll be international competitive bidding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Adnan. Again, thank you to all the panelists, because they've been making my life very easy by answering all the questions in writing. I guess we have one unanswered question from AEDB in particular. Do you have any plans to incorporate the learning from auctions conducted in the past by PPDB and KPK on hydro for, so did the price discovery of some of the projects were based on auctions was not authorized by the regulator? So is the AEDB planning on incorporating the learnings from those auctions as well? Akil Saab, if you would like to respond to that.
Yes, indeed. We have been interacting with the World Bank, with the IFC. USA has been supporting us in devising the auction structure and the RFP documents, and we've been getting advice on the international success stories and how to model the auctions based on our local conditions. But certainly we also have looked into the auctions that were carried out by PDO and PPDB, so as to not to make the same mistakes or just to ensure that this first round of auction is successful, because the future of auction in Pakistan would certainly depend on the success of this first round. That is being taken care of.
Sure, thank you. I believe we don't have any raised hands, and the questions from the Q&A tab are pretty much answered. So I would like to thank you all. Thank you to the panelists again for taking out this time. And this wasn't planned for quite a while. We had to delay due to political circumstances and then some scheduling challenges. But it's great that we have had this done. This is going to be a first in a series of different webinars that we are planning in the future as well, with regards to different policy mechanisms. And so, since obviously Pakistan is transitioning with regards to towards the CTBCM as well, and there are a lot of questions that we believe that need to be answered by experts and again the regulators as well. And we do feel like the private sector has a big role to play as well. I would like to also thank all of our attendees. Again, it was great to see so many developers as a part of this session as well. I would like to thank you all for taking out the time for this and all your questions. Again, let me briefly highlight that Renewables First will be continuing its work. Our goal remains to improve and accelerate the energy transition in Pakistan, make sure that it is just, it is inclusive, but at the same time, it happens at a good pace with regards to energy and environment and climate change. So we do have an RE developers forum in the plans. I believe some of our members are some of the attendees are well aware of that. That is also happening. We are also working on some data modeling. We're also actually developing a renewable energy developer guidebook, so which kind of highlights all of the steps, all of the requirements under CTBCM that you'll have to go through in ensuring that you can set up a power plant in Pakistan. So that is also something that we feel is quite pivotal and would massively aid the developers in ensuring that they can be a part of this change and transition. So please keep a lookout on our website and our social media pages. And thank you all for joining, and thank you to our panelists especially for taking out the time.